In the 5th century BC, Greece was not a unified country, but a union of independent city-states known as polis. Each polis had its government, laws, and army, and their interests often clashed. Among the most prominent were Athens and Sparta, two powers with radically different worldviews. Athens, located in the Attica region, was going through its golden age, no other Greek city equaling it in wealth and splendor. With its revolutionary democracy, Athens was a center of culture and knowledge, home to philosophers, artists, and scientists. Its economy was based on maritime trade, thanks to its powerful fleet and alliances with the cities that made up the League of Delos, which gave it the necessary foundations for the expansion of its emerging empire. Sparta, in contrast, was located in the Peloponnese region and was famous for its militarized society. Ruled by a diarchy, two kings shared power with a council of elders and an assembly. Spartan citizens devoted themselves almost exclusively to military training, delegating agricultural work to a class of serfs called ilotes. Sparta prioritized austerity and duty over luxury and culture. Athens led the League of Delos, an alliance of mainly coastal and Aegean polis, originally formed to defend against Persia. Over time, however, Athens began to use the League for its purposes, turning it into an Athenian empire. Tributes from League members enriched Athens, allowing the construction of monuments, such as the Parthenon, and the maintenance of a powerful navy. Sparta headed the Peloponnesian League, a coalition of polis that encompassed much of the Peloponnese and other Greek regions. Unlike the League of Delos, Sparta's allies enjoyed greater autonomy and paid no tribute. The alliance was based on mutual defense and protection against common threats, including the ambitions of Athens. These two leagues represented not only military alliances, but also opposing ideologies. The naval and commercial democracy of Athens versus the military and landed oligarchy of Sparta. In the year 433 BC, a peace agreement was enforced between Sparta and Athens, which was sealed after the end of the hostilities of past years. This agreement was to last 30 years, but the differences between the Greek powers were not calming down. Athens had expanded its influence and control over territories and trade routes, which provoked resentment and fear. The city of Corinth, an ally of Sparta, felt threatened by the growth of Athenian influence. A significant conflict was that of the island of Corfu, a colony of Corinth, which was being besieged by Epidamno, another Corinthian colony. Corcyra, possessing one of the largest naval fleets in all of Greece, attacked Epidamno, who asked Corinth for help. Corinth supported Epidamno, which led Corcyra to request support from Athens. The Spartans had no interest in a full-scale war at that time, and as leaders of the Peloponnesian League, forced Corinth to make concessions to Corcyra to avoid a major conflict. However, the people of Corcyra still felt threatened and sent emissaries to Athens, who met with Pericles. The emissaries warned Pericles that, if Corcyra fell, Athens would have to face a combined fleet superior to his own. Although making Corcyra a member of the League of Delos would be a direct provocation to Sparta, Pericles instituted an exclusive defensive pact with Corcyra, guaranteeing its defense only in case of external aggression. Corinth and the city of Megara began to advocate war against Athens. The Athenians retaliated by enacting an economic embargo against Megara, forbidding its merchants access to the ports of the Delian League and the Agora of Athens. This embargo was devastating to Megara's economy and showed the growing strength and influence of the Athenian Empire. Sparta could no longer remain inert in the face of the expanding power of Athens and its empire. In the year 431 BC, the tense peace between Athens and Sparta finally broke down, and war broke out in Greece. Sparta and its allies, including Corinth and Megara, were determined to stop the expansion of Athenian power. The Spartan army, known for the toughness and discipline of its soldiers, marched toward Athens, eager to prove its superiority on the battlefield. The initial plan of the Spartans was to invade Attica, the region surrounding Athens, and destroy its agricultural lands to force the Athenians to go out and fight. Knowing their inferiority in ground combat, the Athenians, under the leadership of Pericles, opted for a defensive strategy. Pericles ordered the rural population to take refuge behind the walls of Athens, avoiding confrontation with the Spartan forces. Spartan invasions were devastating. Soldiers burned crops, felled trees, and destroyed villages, seeking to weaken the Athenians' food supply and morale. However, the fortification of Athens and its port, Piraeus, allowed the city to continue to receive supplies by sea, keeping its population and army supplied. As the Spartans devastated the countryside, the powerful Athenian navy launched counterattacks. Athenian ships sailed up and down the Peloponnese, attacking coastal cities allied with Sparta, wreaking havoc and keeping the pressure on their enemies. This strategy of naval warfare allowed Athens to maintain its dominance at sea, despite difficulties on land. The first year of the war was a series of skirmishes and tactical maneuvers. Sparta attempted to force Athens into a decisive battle, while Athens avoided direct combat and focused on harassing and weakening its enemies. This dynamic set the tone for the war, a protracted struggle of attrition and resistance. The Athenian population, crowded inside the city walls, faced difficult conditions. Overcrowding and scarcity of resources began to take their toll. Citizens, accustomed to life in the open air and working in the fields, now found themselves confined and dependent on maritime trade for survival. Despite the challenges, Athenian morale remained high in large part due to Pericles' steadfastness and vision. He believed that patience and endurance would enable Athens to overcome Spartan aggression. His leadership was crucial during these early years, and his strategy of avoiding direct land confrontations proved effective in keeping Athens afloat during this initial period of the war. Pericles, the Athenian strategist, faced an unprecedented threat. With the Spartan army marching toward Athens, the Athenian leader knew that confronting the Spartans in direct combat would be suicidal. The Spartans' strength lay in their land army, famous for its rigorous training and iron discipline. Pericles then decided to adopt a different strategy, one that required patience and endurance. He ordered the Athenian citizens of the rural areas to abandon their lands and take refuge behind the imposing walls of Athens. This decision was difficult for many, who had to leave their homes and fields behind, but it was necessary to protect the city. Pericles was confident that the fortifications of Athens, along with its powerful fleet, could withstand the Spartan siege. As the Spartan army ravaged the Athenian countryside, destroying crops and property, the citizens huddled inside the city. Pericles' strategy depended on maintaining calm and high morale among the Athenians, avoiding confrontations, and trusting that Sparta could not sustain a prolonged war far from home. At the same time, the Athenian fleet was conducting raids along the Peloponnesian coast, attacking Spartan settlements and supply lines. These raids had not only a military purpose, but also a psychological one, to show the Spartans that Athens still had the power to strike far from its walls. Despite these challenges, Pericles' initial strategy effectively prevented Athens' immediate defeat. Though superior in ground combat, the Spartans failed to break through the city's defenses or force a decisive battle. The war continued, with both sides seeking ways to overcome the other, but Pericles' defensive plan had ensured that Athens would continue to hold out, at least for the time being. The second year of the war brought an unexpected calamity for the Athenians. As Sparta continued its periodic invasions of Attica, a deadly plague broke out in Athens. The disease spread rapidly among the population that had taken refuge within the city walls, seeking safety from Spartan attacks. Crowded conditions and lack of proper hygiene contributed to the rapid spread of the plague. The plague struck Athens with devastating force, claiming the lives of thousands of citizens, including soldiers, workers, the elderly, and children. No one was safe, and despair gripped the city. Historians' accounts of the time describe scenes of chaos and suffering, bodies piled in the streets, entire families decimated, and a profound sense of helplessness in the face of disease. Pericles, the visionary leader of Athens, also died of the plague. His death was a severe blow to the Athenians, as he had been the central figure in implementing the defensive strategy and conducting the city's politics. With his loss, Athens was not only left without its most capable leader, but also the spirit of resistance and trust that had held its citizens together crumbled. The plague had a significant impact on Athens' defensive capabilities. With much of its population and army weakened, the city faced difficulties in maintaining its military operations and sustaining morale on the home front. The disease did not discriminate, affecting both the poor and the rich, which deepened social divisions and exacerbated internal tensions. The Athenians, accustomed to prosperity and maritime dominance, found themselves vulnerable. The plague not only decimated their population, but also eroded social cohesion and stability. During this tragedy, Athens had to continue the war against Sparta and its allies, now facing not only an external enemy, but also an unprecedented internal crisis. The human losses and the uncertainty generated by the plague left deep scars on Athenian society. The leaders who succeeded Pericles tried to stay the course, but the absence of their guide left a void difficult to fill. The impact of the plague on Athens was so great that it is remembered as one of the most tragic and decisive events of the Peloponnesian War, an episode that marked the resilience and suffering of a city in its struggle for survival. Thus, with Athens weakened and demoralized by the plague, the Peloponnesian War continued, leading the Greeks into more years of conflict and suffering. The Peloponnesian War was a clash of empires that spanned decades. Amid this struggle, certain battles acquired particular strategic importance. Pylos and Dilius are two notable examples. These confrontations not only altered the balance of power in the Aegean, but also exposed the vulnerabilities of both powers, Athens and Sparta, and laid the groundwork for the events that would culminate in the fall of the Athenian Empire. In the year 425 BC, during the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians, under the leadership of General Demosthenes, launched an expedition into the Peloponnese to establish a base from which they could harass the Spartan forces. They chose to fortify the region of Pylos, located on the southwest coast of the Peloponnese, because of its strategic position. Pylos not only offered a safe natural harbor, but also had easy access to Messenia, a region that had historically been hostile to Sparta. While the Athenians worked feverishly on the fortifications, the Spartan fleet, led by the navarch Alcibiades, attempted to stop these efforts. The Spartans quickly realized that allowing the Athenians to establish a base at Pylos would be a direct threat to their territory and a constant source of raids and attacks. However, Demosthenes and his men managed to repel the initial attacks and complete the defenses, thus establishing a solid position on the coast. The situation at Pylos soon became critical when the Spartans, seeing the seriousness of the threat, decided to act quickly and send a considerable force to besiege the Athenian position and blockade the port. The Spartans deployed both their infantry and fleet to surround Pylos, attempting to cut off supplies and force the Athenians to surrender by starvation. However, the Athenians, taking advantage of their naval superiority, were able to keep supply lines open and receive reinforcements and supplies across the sea. In a reversal of roles, the Athenian fleet, commanded by Cleon, arrived to reinforce Demosthenes at Pylos. The arrival of this additional fleet not only boosted the morale of the defenders, but also complicated the situation for the Spartans, who now faced a battle on two fronts, on land and at sea. The conflict reached a decisive point on the island of Sphacteria, located off the coast of Pylos. A contingent of Spartan soldiers, consisting of approximately 420 men, was trapped on the island, surrounded by Athenian forces. The Spartans found themselves in a desperate situation. For 72 days, the Spartans held out in extreme conditions, facing food shortages, lack of water, and constant minor attacks by the Athenians. The situation in Sphacteria became a mess. The Athenians could not drive the Spartans from the island, and the Spartans could neither escape nor receive reinforcements. In this context, the Athenian leaders, Cleon and Demosthenes, decided to launch a decisive assault against the island, hoping to break the Spartan resistance once and for all. The final assault by the Athenians was vicious. Demosthenes led the Athenian hoplites in a series of coordinated attacks. The Athenians used their numerical superiority and knowledge of the terrain to corner the Spartans, cutting off any chance of retreat. The Spartans, despite their legendary bravery, began to perish under the pressure of the Athenians. Finally, against all odds and in defiance of the expectations of both sides, the Spartans surrendered. This surrender was a severe blow to Spartan prestige, as it was considered that a true Spartan never surrendered. The capture of the Spartans at Sphacteria, many of them belonging to the Spartan nobility, was a symbolic and strategic victory for Athens. It provided Athens with a valuable bargaining chip and proved that even Greece's most feared warriors could become defeated and captured. For Sparta, the defeat at Sphacteria was a humiliation. The loss of so many valuable soldiers and the surrender of a Spartan force were devastating blows to their military reputation. The Spartan surrender at Sphacteria was especially significant because it challenged the image of invincibility and the Spartan code of honor, which glorified fighting to the death. This defeat forced Sparta to reconsider its tactics and seek new ways to counter the Athenian threat. The Battle of Delius. In 424 BC, the Athenians, under the command of the strategist Hippocrates, undertook an ambitious campaign in the region of Boeotia. This operation aimed to expand Athenian influence in the region by fortifying the city of Delio and using it as a base of operations to launch future raids. Boeotia was a region of strategic importance, controlled by a confederation of cities allied with Sparta, led by Thebes. The Athenians moved quickly toward Delio, located near the northeastern coast of Boeotia. The plan was to build sturdy fortifications that would ensure control over the city and provide a secure base from which they could launch operations against the Boeotian forces and their Spartan allies. Hippocrates led his troops by personally supervising the construction of the defenses. However, the Athenian move did not go unnoticed. The Boeotian forces, alerted by the activity at Delium, began to mobilize. The Boeotian Confederation, known for its military discipline and ability to act quickly, assembled an army under the command of Pagondas, an experienced and astute Theban general. Pagondas saw the seriousness of the Athenian threat and decided to engage them before they could consolidate their position. The Boeotian forces quickly marched toward Delius, determined to intercept and defeat the Athenians. Pagondas planned a strategy that capitalized on the advantages of the terrain and the disposition of his troops. Meanwhile, the Athenians, confident of their numerical superiority and the quality of their hoplites, prepared to engage the Boeotians in a pitched battle. The battle was fought near Delius, on the ground that favored the defenders. The Athenians formed their ranks in a classic hoplite formation, with their surrounding shields and spears ready to repel any attack. Hippocrates, leading from the front, was confident that his men could withstand the enemy onslaught and hold their position. Pagondas, for his part, adopted an innovative tactic. He divided his army into two wings and hid a significant part of his cavalry in a nearby forest. This maneuver was intended to surprise the Athenians and destabilize their ranks. During the engagement, he ordered his cavalry to make a surprise attack on the Athenian left flank, causing confusion and panic among the enemy ranks. At the same time, he launched a frontal charge with his heavy infantry. The battle began with a series of direct engagements between the Athenian hoplites and the Boeotians. The well-trained and disciplined Athenians initially managed to hold their line and repel the frontal attacks. However, Pagondas' tactical surprise soon began to take effect. The Boeotian cavalry, suddenly emerging from the forest, charged the Athenian left flank with great momentum. The attack of the Boeotian cavalry was destructive. The Athenians, taken by surprise, found themselves at a disadvantage and began to crumble. Confusion and panic quickly spread through the Athenian ranks. The hoplites, accustomed to fighting in close formations, were unprepared to face a cavalry charge from an unprotected flank. Seeing his left flank collapse, Hippocrates attempted to reorganize his forces and counter the attack, but the situation quickly deteriorated. The Boeotians, taking advantage of the chaos, launched a renewed frontal attack with their infantry, putting even more pressure on the Athenians. During the confusion, Hippocrates was mortally wounded and fell on the battlefield, further aggravating the disorganization and demoralization of the Athenian troops. The defeat of the Athenians at Delius was complete. Their lines were broken, and the panic-stricken soldiers began to flee in disarray. The Boeotians, under the command of Pagondas, pursued the retreating Athenians, inflicting heavy casualties and securing a decisive victory. The Athenians suffered significant losses, and the Battle of Delius became one of the worst defeats for Athens during the first phase of the Peloponnesian War. The Battle of Delius had important military and political consequences. For Athens, the defeat in Boeotia was a severe blow. It underscored the limitations of its land strategy and highlighted the need to reevaluate its tactics and approach to warfare. The death of Hippocrates, a respected commander, was also a significant loss for the Athenians, who had to face not only the military setback, but also the need to find new leaders capable of guiding their troops in future campaigns. Politically, the defeat weakened Athens' position in the region and weakened its ability to project power in Boeotia. The polis allied with Athens began to question the effectiveness of its leadership and to reevaluate their alliances. Confidence in Athens' ability to protect its allies and maintain its supremacy in the region was seriously shaken. For the Boeotians, and particularly for Thebes, the victory at Delium consolidated their position as a formidable military force and a valuable ally of Sparta. The successful tactics of Pagondas and the resounding defeat inflicted on the Athenians demonstrated the ability of the Boeotians to confront and overcome one of the most powerful powers in Greece. This strengthened the Boeotian-Spartan alliance and increased the influence of Thebes in the Boeotian Confederation. Despite this victory, the war was far from over. The war would continue with new battles and campaigns. The Peloponnesian War would continue to remain a conflict that would shape the destiny of the Greek polis. However, during this war, an opportunity for peace arose. The Peace of Nicias, a seemingly impossible agreement. By 421 BC, the Peloponnesian War had already lasted 10 long years. The conflict exhausted Athens and Sparta, the two major powers of ancient Greece. The countryside was devastated. The cities were suffering from shortages of food and resources, and the population was tired of continuous warfare. The political landscape in both cities had changed. In Athens, Cleon, the leader who advocated continuing the war, had been killed in the Battle of Amphipolis in 422 BC. His passing left a vacuum in the city's warmongering leadership. In Sparta, General Brasidas also lost his life in the same battle. These losses opened the door to more moderate voices on both sides. In Athens, Nicias, a respected politician and general, gained influence. Nicias was known for his caution and preference for stability. He saw war as an unnecessary risk to Athens' prosperity and believed it was time to seek peace. At an assembly in Athens, Nicias took the floor. "Citizens of Athens, we have fought bravely for years, but at what cost? Our fields are wasteland. Our men fall in distant lands. It is time to seek peace and regain our strength." His words reached many war-weary Athenians. However, not everyone agreed. Some ambitious young men, like Alcibiades, saw war as an opportunity to gain glory and power. But for the time being, the voice of moderation prevailed. In Sparta, the situation was similar. The loss of Brasidas had left the Spartans without their most effective general. In addition, the city faced internal problems. The Iolothians, Sparta's subject population, had rebelled, taking advantage of the chaos of war. Spartan leaders feared that a prolonged war would weaken their control over their territory. Negotiations began cautiously. Both sides sent emissaries to discuss the terms of a possible agreement. The discussions were long and complicated. Each city wanted to secure its interests and those of its allies. One of the most difficult points was the fate of the cities and territories conquered during the war. Athens wanted to recover Amphipolis, a strategic colony in northern Greece. Sparta, for its part, sought the release of Spartan prisoners captured years earlier on the island of Sphacteria. The discussions went on for weeks. Envoys went back and forth between Athens and Sparta, bringing proposals and counter-proposals. Finally, after so much debate, an agreement was reached. The main terms of the treaty, which would later become known as the Peace of Nicias, included a 50-year truce between Athens and Sparta, the mutual return of territories captured during the war, the exchange of prisoners, respect for alliances existing before the conflict, and an agreement to settle future disputes by arbitration. The treaty was a compromise. Neither side got everything it wanted, but both saw advantages in the agreement. For Athens, it meant a chance to recover and strengthen its position without the constant threat of invasion. For Sparta, it was a chance to consolidate its internal control and prepare for future challenges. In the spring of 421 BC, representatives of both cities met for the official signing of the treaty. The ceremony was solemn, marked by sacrifices to the gods and oaths on both sides. Nicias, as the prime mover of the agreement in Athens, played a prominent role in the ceremony. Addressing those present, he said, "May this peace bring prosperity to our cities and all Greece. May the gods bear witness to our commitment to peace." News of the signing of the treaty spread quickly throughout Greece. In Athens and Sparta, people celebrated in the streets. After years of war, the prospect of peace was welcomed by many. However, not everyone was satisfied. Some allies on both sides felt betrayed or ignored in the agreement. In Corinth and Thebes, allies of Sparta, there was discontent over what they considered excessive concessions to Athens. In Athens, while most celebrated, voices such as Alcibiades warned that the peace would not last. Despite these dissenting voices, the Peace of Nicias marked the official end of the first phase of the Peloponnesian War. For the time being, the guns fell silent, and the warships remained anchored in the harbors. The following months saw an increase in trade between Greek cities. Families separated by the war were reunited. In the fields, farmers returned to planting without fear that their crops would be destroyed by enemy armies. Nicias, the architect of peace, gained prestige in Athens. Many saw him as the savior of the city, the man who had brought peace after years of conflict. However, it would soon become apparent that keeping the peace would be as difficult as achieving it. The Peace of Nicias, though welcomed by many, was in reality a fragile agreement. The root causes of the conflict between Athens and Sparta, the rivalry for dominance of Greece, the differences in their political systems, and their imperial ambitions were still present. The Peace of Nicias, though promising at its inception, was soon challenged by a series of minor conflicts that undermined its stability. The treaty, signed in the hope of ending a decade of war, faced obstacles almost from the beginning. One of the most significant problems was the dispute over Amphipolis. This colony, strategically located on the Aegean coast, was of great importance to Athens. Under the terms of the treaty, Sparta was to return it to the Athenians. However, the Spartans did not fulfill this obligation, which generated frustration and distrust in Athens. The Athenian general Nicias, who had worked tirelessly to achieve peace, found himself in a difficult position, trying to maintain the agreement while facing criticism for the lack of progress in the recovery of Amphipolis. Meanwhile, within the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta, altercations arose. Some of Sparta's most powerful allies, such as Corinth and Boeotia, refused to sign the peace treaty. These states saw the agreement as a betrayal of their interests and feared that Sparta had abandoned them in favor of an understanding with Athens. This situation created tensions within the Spartan alliance and limited Sparta's ability to fully comply with the terms of the treaty. In Athens, the politician Alcibiades began to gain influence. Young, charismatic, and ambitious, Alcibiades saw peace as an obstacle to his and Athens' aspirations. Capitalizing on discontent over the Amphipolis situation and other treaty breaches, Alcibiades advocated a more aggressive policy. His arguments found a receptive audience among Athenians who felt that peace had not lived up to its promises. In 420 BC, Athens took a bold step by allying with Argos, Mantinea, and Alide. This new coalition, while not directly violating the terms of the Peace of Nicias, was viewed with alarm by Sparta. The Spartans interpreted it as an attempt by Athens to encircle and isolate them in the Peloponnese, their territory. This diplomatic maneuver significantly increased tensions between the two powers. The situation came to a head in 418 BC with the Battle of Mantinea. Although this conflict did not directly involve Athens and Sparta, it had a significant impact on the balance of power in Greece. The battle pitted Sparta against the coalition led by Argos, which included troops from Athens. The Spartans, under the leadership of King Aegeus II, won a decisive victory, reasserting their military supremacy in the Peloponnese. The Spartan victory at Mantinea had far-reaching consequences. It strengthened Sparta's position within its league and weakened the new Athenian alliance. In Athens, the defeat of its allies generated debates about the effectiveness of its foreign policy and increased criticism of the strategy of Nicias. During this period, minor conflicts also arose in other parts of the Greek world. Territorial disputes, commercial rivalries, and struggles for political influence continued to occur, despite the peace treaty. These constant frictions kept alive the distrust between the Greek states and hindered any attempt to consolidate a lasting peace. As the years passed, it became increasingly clear that the Peace of Nicias was more a pause in hostilities than a true end to the conflict. Leaders on both sides, aware of the underlying tensions, began to prepare for the possibility that war might resume at any moment. In this climate of uncertainty and distrust, both Athens and Sparta continued to strengthen their military and diplomatic positions. Peace, which had once been celebrated as the end of an era of conflict, was gradually becoming the prelude to a new phase of war. The Peace of Nicias, which had maintained an uneasy truce between Athens and Sparta since 421 BC, began to slowly crumble in the following years. Despite initial intentions to maintain peace for 50 years, the political realities and ambitions of both city-states soon tested the limits of the agreement. In Athens, the debate over a possible expedition to Sicily reached its peak. Alcibiades, a charismatic and ambitious Athenian politician, became the main advocate of this venture. In the Athenian assembly, Alcibiades argued passionately, "Sicily offers us not only riches, but the opportunity to expand our empire and weaken our enemies." This attracted the attention of ambitious young Athenians, eager for the glory and profits that such an expedition promised. However, Nicias, the architect of the peace that bore his name, strongly objected. In a speech to the assembly, he warned, "To embark on this Sicilian adventure is to risk all that we have achieved. Our real enemies are here, in Greece, not across the sea." Despite his warnings, the assembly voted in favor of the expedition, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. News of the Athenian preparations for the expedition to Sicily reached Sparta quickly. Spartan leaders saw this as a clear violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the peace treaty. At an emergency meeting of the Spartan council, King Aegeus II declared, "The Athenians showed their true nature. While they spoke of peace, they planned conquest. We must act now to protect not only Sparta, but all of Greece." Meanwhile, Sparta's allies, especially Corinth, were increasingly pressing for decisive action against Athens. The Corinthians, concerned about their commercial interests in Sicily, sent emissaries to Sparta. In response to these pressures, Sparta began to quietly mobilize its forces. Although war had not yet been officially declared, the Spartans began preparations for a possible conflict. The defenses of allied cities were reinforced, new troops were trained, and plans were laid to disrupt Athenian supply lines. The political climate throughout Greece became increasingly tense. Cities that had remained neutral during the peace were now forced to choose sides. Thebes, Athens' traditional rival, strengthened its ties with Sparta. Other cities, fearing the growing power of the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta, sought protection from Athens. In this atmosphere of growing hostility, even minor incidents assumed disproportionate importance. A clash between Athenian and Corinthian trading ships near Corcyra nearly provoked open warfare. Although the incident was resolved diplomatically, it made clear how fragile the peace was. As 414 BC drew to a close, the Peace of Nicias existed in name only. Athens and Sparta were effectively in a state of Cold War, with both sides actively preparing for the conflict they considered inevitable. Athens' decision to proceed with the expedition to Sicily, despite warnings from Nicias and others, would be the final catalyst for the full resumption of hostilities. This action not only unleashed the wrath of Sparta and her allies, but also divided Athens itself, setting the stage for one of the most turbulent and decisive periods of the Peloponnesian War. With peace broken, Sparta and Athens prepared for a new confrontation. Negotiations and attempts at reconciliation were in the past, and both cities knew that only war would decide the future of Greece. Nicias, who had fought to maintain peace, found himself politically isolated, while Alcibiades and other militaristic leaders took control of Athenian politics. With the Peace of Nicias in ruins, Athens and Sparta prepared to resume their conflict. However, before directly confronting each other, Athens would turn its gaze westward to a wealthy and distant island. This decision would usher in a new phase in the war, one that would test the limits of Athenian power as never before. In 416 BC, the city-state of Athens was in a position of apparent stability. The Peace of Nicias, signed in 421 BC, had temporarily ended hostilities with Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. However, Athenian ambitions had not been extinguished. In this context, ambassadors from the city of Segesta, located on the island of Sicily, arrived in Athens. The Segestaeans were seeking help against their rival, Selimant, which was supported by the powerful Syracuse. This request was not merely a local matter. It represented an opportunity for Athens to expand its influence in the Western Mediterranean. Alcibiades, a charismatic young Athenian politician, saw in this situation a unique opportunity. With characteristic eloquence, he argued before the assembly that an expedition to Sicily would not only help Athens' allies, but would also serve to counter the growing power of Syracuse, an ally of Sparta. During the winter of 416 to 415 BC, the Athenian assembly met to discuss the proposal. The discussions were heated. On the one hand, Alcibiades and his followers painted a picture of glory and riches awaiting them in Sicily. On the other, the experienced General Nicias warned about the dangers of such a partnership. A cautious Nicias argued that Athens had barely recovered from the years of war against Sparta, and that an expedition to Sicily would be costly and risky. He pointed to the geographical distance, the lack of knowledge of the terrain, and the possibility that the Syracusans would receive help from their Peloponnesian allies. Despite these warnings, the assembly, influenced by the rhetoric of Alcibiades and the promise of new conquests, voted in favor of the expedition. The decision was made in the spring of 415 BC, and preparations began immediately. The scale of the expedition was impressive. The Athenians assembled a fleet of 134 triremes, warships that were the pride of the Athenian navy. In addition, 5,100 hoplites, heavy infantrymen who formed the core of the land army, were recruited. These were joined by numerous supply ships and auxiliary troops. The logistics of the operation were complicated. Large quantities of food, water, and other supplies were needed to sustain thousands of men during a prolonged campaign in distant lands. Athens' arsenals were working around the clock to equip the fleet and the army. 3 generals were appointed to lead the expedition. Alcibiades, the driving force behind the plan. Nicias, who despite his initial opposition was chosen for his experience. And Lamechus, a commander respected for his bravery on the battlefield. The city buzzed with activity and expectation. Young Athenians were enlisting, attracted by the promise of adventure and riches. Merchants saw opportunities for new markets. Politicians were calculating how this expedition might affect the balance of power in the Greek world. As the date of departure approached, tension in Athens mounted. Sacrifices to the gods multiplied, seeking their favor for the expedition. Soothsayers were frequently consulted, and their predictions were the subject of intense debate. Finally, in June 415 BC, the day of departure arrived. Piraeus, the port of Athens, was crowded. The fleet, with its sails unfurled and its freshly painted hulls, presented an impressive sight. Soldiers were bidding farewell to their families, some with confidence, others with apprehension. No one could foresee at the time what consequences this expedition would have for the future of Athens and the course of the Peloponnesian War. However, the expedition soon faced its first obstacle. Shortly after its departure, Alcibiades, one of the main strategists, was accused of desecrating the Hermes in Athens. The Athenian assembly sent the ship Salamis to bring Alcibiades back and face trial. The charismatic general, fearing for his life, decided to escape. Instead of returning to Athens, he fled to Sparta, leaving Nicias and Lamachus in command of the expedition. This loss of leadership was a severe blow to Athenian morale and strategy. In the late summer of 415 BC, the fleet reached the coast of Sicily. The Athenians established their base at Catania, from where they planned their operations. Initially, they achieved some minor successes, but soon encountered stronger resistance than expected. The winter of 415 to 414 BC was spent preparing for the siege of Syracuse, the most powerful city in Sicily. In the spring of 414 BC, the Athenians began their offensive. They built a fort at Labdalo, on the heights of Evepolis, and began to erect a ring wall around Syracuse. The Syracusans, led by Hermocrates, attempted to counter these actions by building transverse walls to interrupt the Athenian encirclement. In one of these battles, the Athenian general Lamachus died, leaving Nicias as sole commander. Despite these setbacks, the Athenians made some significant advances. By July 414 BC, they had completed much of the southern wall and were making progress in the north. Syracuse appeared to be on the verge of surrender. However, the course of the war changed dramatically with the arrival of the Spartan general Gylippus in August 414 BC. Gylippus revitalized the Syracusan defense and organized effective counterattacks. Under his leadership, the Syracusans built a wall that prevented the Athenians from completing their encirclement. In the autumn of 414 BC, the Syracusans launched a surprise attack on the Athenian fortifications at Evepolis, capturing the fort of Labdalo. This blow forced the Athenians to abandon their siege plans and adopt a defensive posture. Nicias, ill and demoralized, sent letters to Athens requesting reinforcements or permission to withdraw. The Athenian assembly, instead of authorizing the withdrawal, decided to send a second expedition under the command of Demosthenes and Eurymedon. Meanwhile, in the spring of 413 BC, the Syracusans, increasingly confident, decided to engage the Athenians at sea. Although the Athenians were superior in naval tactics, the Syracusans had modified their ships for combat in the confined waters of Syracuse harbor. In a series of naval battles, the Syracusans inflicted significant losses on the Athenian fleet. In July 413 BC, Athenian reinforcements led by Demosthenes and Eurymedon arrived. Demosthenes, recognizing the desperate situation, advocated an immediate withdrawal. However, Nicias resisted, fearing the reaction in Athens. Demosthenes then proposed a night attack on the Syracusan fortifications at Evepolis. This attack, carried out in August 413 BC, ended in disaster for the Athenians. In the confusion of the night, the Athenian troops became disorganized and suffered heavy losses. After this failure, even Nicias accepted the need to retreat. However, a lunar eclipse on August 27, 413 BC was interpreted by the soothsayers as a bad omen, leading Nicias to delay departure for 27 days. This delay proved fatal. The Syracusans, taking advantage of Athenian indecision, blocked the entrance to the large harbor with a line of ships. In September 413 BC, a decisive naval battle took place in the harbor. The Athenian fleet, trapped in the confined space, was completely defeated. With their fleet destroyed, the Athenians had no choice but to attempt an overland retreat. On September 3, 413 BC, the Athenian army began its march, pursued by Syracusan forces and their allies. Exhausted, starving, and demoralized, the Athenians were constantly harassed. On September 7, Demosthenes' forces were surrounded and forced to surrender. 2 days later, on September 9, the troops of Nicias met the same fate near the Aesoneris River. Thousands of Athenian soldiers were slaughtered trying to cross the river. Nicias and Demosthenes were captured and executed, despite the efforts of Gylippus to save them to take them as prisoners to Sparta. The surviving Athenian soldiers were sent to the stone quarries of Syracuse, where many died of starvation and disease. The defeat in Sicily shook the foundations of mighty Athens. In the autumn of 413 BC, when news of the disaster reached the city, shock and disbelief quickly spread among its inhabitants. The Athenians, accustomed to victory and glory, suddenly found themselves facing a brutal and bewildering reality. The loss of life was devastating. Of the more than 40,000 men who left on the expedition, almost none returned. Entire families were left without fathers, brothers, and sons. The streets of Athens, once bustling and full of life, became somber and silent. Mourning gripped the city, and temples filled with citizens seeking solace and answers from the gods. Economically, the blow was equally severe. Athens had invested an astronomical amount of resources in the expedition. The state coffers, once brimming with tribute from the League of Delos, were now virtually empty. The city faced an unprecedented financial crisis. The Athenian fleet, the pride of the city, and the basis of its imperial power had been decimated. Of the 134 triremes that sailed for Sicily, barely a few managed to escape. The loss of these ships and the experienced crews that manned them was a blow from which Athens would never fully recover. By the winter of 413 to 412 BC, the political situation in Athens was chaotic. The leaders who had promoted the expedition were severely criticized. The assembly, divided and demoralized, struggled to find a clear direction. Meanwhile, Athens' enemies saw their opportunity. Sparta, emboldened by the defeat of its rival, intensified its war efforts. In the spring of 412 BC, the Spartans sent aid to Ionian cities that sought to rebel against Athenian rule. Chios, one of Athens' most important allies, was the first to declare its independence, quickly followed by Erythras and Clazomans. In the summer of 412 BC, Alcibiades, the general who had fled to Sparta, convinced the Spartans to fortify Decelia, a strategic position in Attica. This action cut off food supplies to Athens and deprived the city of income from its silver mines in Laurion, further aggravating its economic crisis. Nevertheless, Athens refused to surrender. In the autumn of 412 BC, the city began to rebuild its fleet, using an emergency reserve they had stored on the Acropolis. This effort demonstrated the Athenians' resilience, but it also underscored the gravity of their situation. They were using their last resources in a desperate attempt to maintain their position. The defeat in Sicily marked the beginning of the end for the Athenian Empire. Although the city would continue to fight for nearly a decade more, it never regained the strength and influence it once had. In 413 BC, the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta entered a new phase. After the disastrous Athenian expedition to Sicily, the balance of power shifted. Sparta, seeing an opportunity to defeat Athens, sought new forms of pressure. Persia, formerly an enemy of both, changed its policy. It did not support Sparta out of affinity, but out of interest. Athens controlled Greek cities in Asia Minor, which Persia wished to regain. Darius I, the great Persian king, saw in Sparta the opportunity to weaken Athens and regain his influence in these cities. The satrap Tissaphernes negotiated with Sparta. In exchange for military and logistical support, Sparta would return the Ionian cities to Persia after defeating Athens. Persian intervention was cautious at first, sending small amounts of money to Sparta, but in time, Persia financed the construction of a Spartan fleet, a weak point of Sparta until then. Although it was a land power, with Persian help, Sparta was able to take on the Athenian navy at sea. For Athens, this represented a serious threat. Its naval supremacy had been key to maintaining its empire and supply lines. Now Sparta was contesting control of the Aegean, with ships financed by Persia. Athenian naval defeats multiplied, increasing the economic pressure on Athens, which was already suffering from the Spartan occupation of Decelia. Persian money was not only used to build ships, but also to pay crews and maintain the war. The better-equipped Spartan crews could fight longer. Athens tried to maintain control of the sea, but defeats and internal pressure affected its ability to continue. Persian intervention was decisive. Persia not only provided material resources, but kept Sparta focused on the war. The Spartans, previously reluctant to prolonged campaigns, were motivated by financial support and the possibility of ultimate victory. With each step Persia took in favor of Sparta, Athens grew weaker. In 413 BC, Sparta fortified Decelia, a strategic position 20 kilometers north of Athens, proposed by Alcibiades, an exiled Athenian. This direct occupation of Attica cut off supply routes and weakened the Athenian economy. The Spartans devastated crops and cut off access to the silver mines of Laurium, Athens' main source of income. Athens' situation, already weakened by the expedition to Sicily, worsened. The population took refuge inside the walls, causing overcrowding and food shortages. Thousands of slaves defected to the Spartan camp, further weakening the Athenian economy. The fortification of Decelia not only attacked the Athenian economy, but also its morale. The city, though protected by walls, was becoming strangled by occupation. With each passing day, Athens grew weaker, and its ability to resist diminished. Battles at sea became an unexpected challenge for Athens. With Persian money, Sparta was able to build a sizable fleet, something it had failed to do in the early years of the war. Despite their lack of experience, the Spartans began to compete with Athens in the Aegean. Athens tried to maintain its control of the sea, knowing that much of its power depended on its fleet. At first, their ships were superior and could stand up to Sparta, but gradually they began to lose ground. Sparta, with its new fleet financed by Persia, managed to win some important battles. Each Spartan victory weakened the Athenian forces, not only at sea but also on land, as Athens' allies began to question their ability to lead. One of the most significant battles was that of Notio in 406 BC. There, the Spartans, led by Lysander, managed to defeat the Athenian fleet. This battle was a heavy blow to Athens. Although it was not the first time they had lost a naval battle, it was a clear indication that their dominance over the sea was in danger. The defeat at Notio caused a change in their allies' perception of Athens' power. Several cities, which had previously paid tribute and depended on Athens for protection, began to look to Sparta for support. In addition to the military loss, this situation severely affected Athens' economy. Cities that rebelled stopped paying tribute, which meant fewer resources to maintain the war. In turn, trade routes, which had been dominated by Athenian ships for years, began to collapse. Athens could no longer protect them effectively, which affected its ability to sustain its economy in the war. As Sparta continued to strengthen its fleet, Athens found itself trapped in an increasingly complicated situation. Defeats at sea meant fewer resources, fewer ships, and fewer allies. Internally, the Athenian people began to lose faith in their leaders. The war, which had already lasted many years, was becoming more costly and seemed increasingly difficult to win. Sparta, with the support of Persia, continued to advance. The situation worsened for Athens, which could no longer count on the naval power that had given it such an advantage at the beginning of the war. Control of the sea, so vital to their survival, was slipping from their grasp. Alcibiades was a man who seemed to be at the center of everything, both in Athens and Sparta. Of noble birth and with great charisma, Alcibiades knew how to get noticed and gain the trust of those around him. However, his ambition and impulsive behavior brought him into conflict with Athenian society. After becoming accused of sacrilege, he feared for his life, and before facing trial, fled to Sparta, where he found a new place to demonstrate his political and military prowess. In Sparta, Alcibiades did not remain a mere exile. On the contrary, he quickly gained the confidence of the Spartan leadership and began to offer them valuable advice. It was he who suggested occupying Decelia, a move that weakened Athens and ushered in a new phase in the war. Although some Spartans distrusted him because of his past in Athens, Alcibiades managed to gain an important place in their court, helping to plan key strategies against their ancient city. However, his relationship with Sparta was not long-lasting either. Rumors of an affair with the wife of King Agis put him in danger, and again he had to flee, this time seeking refuge in Persia. Alcibiades knew how to adapt and used his time in Persia to stay relevant in the Greek conflicts. There, he worked with the satrap Tissaphernes, negotiating and offering his services to maintain his influence in both Sparta and Athens. His ability to move between sides and survive in difficult situations was impressive. Alcibiades, having betrayed Athens and spent time in Sparta, found himself with no fixed place to belong. His relationship with the Spartans, which had started well thanks to his strategic advice, ended up deteriorating. Alcibiades, fearful for his safety and well-being, decided to escape before the Spartans eliminated him, seeking refuge in Persia. During his time in Persia, Alcibiades allied himself with the satrap Tissaphernes, who offered him asylum. There he tried to play a double game, helping the Persians, but also maintaining ties with Athens. However, as the war continued, Athens was losing more and more strength, and his return began to look like a viable option, especially after a series of Spartan defeats on the Hellespont. In Athens, the situation was desperate. Constant defeats, loss of allies, and financial pressure were suffocating the city. It was in this context that the Athenians began to consider bringing back Alcibiades. Although he had betrayed his city, many saw in him a last hope for reversing the course of the war. Alcibiades, always ready to seize any opportunity, accepted the offer to return. In 408 BC, he was received in Athens as a hero. His return was almost triumphant, for many believed that he was the person who could save Athens from disaster. Alcibiades, now commander of the Athenian fleet, wasted no time and sprang into action. In a short time, he achieved a series of naval victories, which boosted the morale of the Athenians and restored some hope to them. Alcibiades took the opportunity to recapture some cities that had defected from the Athenian alliance, which strengthened his prestige and power in the city. During his brief time in command, Alcibiades continued to win important victories for Athens. His strategic ability was undeniable, and the battles he won gave the Athenians a breathing space during the war. However, confidence in him was never full. Alcibiades was a controversial figure, marked by his ambitions and his constant changes of sides. Alcibiades' downfall began when, during one of his absences, his fleet suffered a significant defeat at the Battle of Notio in 406 BC. Although he was not present during the battle, Alcibiades was primarily responsible, as he had left his subordinate Antiochus in command, who disobeyed orders and ended up losing the battle. This defeat, although it was not decisive in military terms, was decisive in political terms for Alcibiades. His enemies in Athens took the opportunity to remove him from office and blame him for the defeat. Stripped of his command, and with few options in Athens, Alcibiades decided to go into exile again, this time to a private estate in Thrace. There he lived for a time in relative calm, away from the chaos of the war that continued in Greece. However, his exile would not last forever. The Spartans, who had never forgotten his treachery, kept a close eye on his movements. In 404 BC, with the war almost over and Athens on the brink of defeat, Alcibiades was assassinated. The exact circumstances of his death are a matter of debate, but it is believed to have been ordered by the satrap Pharnabazo under pressure from the Spartans. Alcibiades died as he lived, surrounded by intrigue and betrayal, never finding a safe place to call home. The fall of Alcibiades marked the end of an era for Athens. However, the city still had to face its last great naval battle before its final surrender. This decisive encounter took place in the waters near the Arginusus Islands, between Lesbos and the coast of Asia Minor. In the summer of 406 BC, the Athenian fleet was in dire straits. The Spartan admiral Callicratides had succeeded in blockading the Athenian strategist Conon in the port of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos. Athens, knowing the gravity of the situation, gathered all its available forces to break the blockade and save Conon and his men. The Athenian assembly took extreme measures to assemble a fleet capable of confronting the Spartans. All men of fighting age were recruited, including slaves, who were promised freedom if they fought. Gold and silver statues were also melted down to finance the construction of new ships. In all, Athens managed to assemble a fleet of 150 triremes. The Athenian fleet set sail for Lesbos under the command of 8 strategists: Phrasilas, Aristocrates, Diomedon, Erycinides, Pericles the younger, son of the famous Pericles, Aristogenes, Lysias, and Protomachus. Arriving at the Arginusus Islands, they encountered the Spartan fleet of Callicrates, which had 120 ships. The battle began with the Athenians forming their fleet in 2 lines, an unusual tactic that surprised the Spartans. Callicratides, confident in his experience and the superiority of his sailors, decided to attack the center of the Athenian formation directly. The initial clash was brutal. The ships rammed each other, while archers and infantrymen fought hand-to-hand on the decks. The noise of combat was loud, the crack of wood breaking, the shouts of men, and the clash of metal against metal. Callicrates personally led the Spartan attack, directing his ship against the Athenian lines. However, during the confusion of the battle, his ship was rammed by an Athenian trireme. The impact was so strong that Callicrates fell overboard and drowned in the Aegean Sea. The death of the Spartan admiral sowed chaos among his forces. Without clear leadership, the coordination of the Spartan fleet quickly fell apart. The Athenians, sensing the enemy's confusion, redoubled their efforts and began to break through the Spartan lines. As the battle progressed, the numerical superiority of the Athenians began to make itself felt. The Spartan ships found themselves surrounded and outnumbered. Many were sunk or captured, while others managed to escape to the nearby coast. By the end of the day, the Athenian victory was complete. The Spartans had lost 70 ships, while the Athenians lost only 25. Thousands of Spartans and their allies were killed or captured. The blockade of Mytilene was lifted, and Conon and his men were released. The Battle of the Arginusus was the last great naval victory of Athens in the Peloponnesian War. It showed that, even after years of defeat and despair, the city could still muster the resources and will to achieve a decisive victory. However, the Athenian victory at the Arginusus was soon marred by a scandal that rocked the city. After the battle, it was learned that the generals had failed to rescue the shipwrecked and recover the bodies of the fallen. A storm had prevented these tasks, but for many Athenians, this did not justify the breach of a sacred duty. In Athenian society, rescuing survivors and recovering bodies for proper burial were fundamental obligations. These practices were rooted in Greek religion and ethics. It was believed that the souls of the unburied dead wandered without rest, and that the gods frowned upon those who did not honor their fallen. News of the abandonment of the castaways and bodies caused a wave of indignation in Athens. Families of the lost sailors mourn not only the death of their loved ones, but the impossibility of giving them a proper burial. Citizens concerned about respect for traditions raised their voices in protest. Political opponents of the generals took advantage of the situation to demand exemplary punishment. Pressure on the assembly, the main organ of Athenian democracy, grew rapidly. The generals were summoned to return to Athens to face trial. Of the 10 leaders who had commanded the fleet in the Arginuses, 2 decided not to return for fear of the danger they faced. The other 8 appeared before the assembly, confident they could explain their actions and become exonerated. The trial that followed was extraordinary in so many ways, and not precisely because it adhered to legality. Instead of trying each general separately, as was the custom and law in Athens, it was decided to hold a collective trial. This decision, already questionable in itself, was aggravated when it was proposed that the assembly vote only once to decide the fate of all the accused together. Some citizens, including the philosopher Socrates, who that day was part of the committee presiding over the assembly, strongly opposed this procedure. They argued that it violated Athenian laws and basic principles of justice. Socrates was characterized by his integrity and his courage in facing the crowds. He refused to allow a vote to take place that he considered illegal. However, the majority of Athenians, moved by anger, grief, and perhaps by the manipulation of skilled orators, supported the mass trial. The generals tried to defend themselves as best they could. They explained the difficult conditions they faced after the battle. They spoke of the strength of the storm, which made any rescue attempt dangerous. They detailed how they had given orders to other officers to take care of the castaways while they pursued the retreating Spartan fleet, a strategic decision that sought to fully secure victory. But his words fell on deaf ears. The crowd in the assembly was more interested in finding fault than in understanding the complications of the situation. Speakers calling for the general's condemnation appealed to the emotions of the audience, vividly describing the suffering of those marooned at sea and the anguish of families with no bodies to bury. The vote took place amid a tumult. The assembly voted to condemn the generals to death. 6 of the 8 present were sentenced to death. Among the condemned was Pericles the Younger, son of the famous statesman Pericles, who had led Athens in the early years of the Peloponnesian War. The execution took place shortly thereafter. The generals, who days earlier had been celebrated as heroes for their victory, now faced death at the hands of their city. The method of execution, probably the forced ingestion of hemlock, was the same as that used for common criminals. The consequences of this trial were immediate and lasting. The execution of victorious generals was a blow to army and fleet morale. Many officers and soldiers wondered whether it was worth risking their lives for a city that could so easily condemn them because of the circumstances of the battle. The episode also exposed the flaws in the Athenian democratic system. The ease with which established laws and procedures had been ignored, yielding to popular pressure and the emotions of the moment, caused many to question the wisdom of leaving such important decisions in the hands of an easily swayed assembly. Divisions in Athenian society deepened. While some saw the condemnation as a necessary act of justice, others saw it as a tragic mistake motivated by fear and superstition. These divisions further weakened a city already exhausted by years of war. On the military front, Athens faced a growing shortage of capable leadership. The remaining commanders became overly cautious, fearing that any controversial decision could lead them to a fate similar to that of their predecessors. This conservative attitude limited Athens' ability to seize strategic opportunities and respond nimbly to enemy maneuvers. Economically, Athens found itself in an increasingly precarious position. The cost of maintaining a large and active fleet had always been high, but now it has become almost unsustainable. Wealthy citizens, who had traditionally financed the construction of triremes as part of their civic obligations, began to look for ways to evade these responsibilities. Athens' naval base, fundamental to its power, began to slowly deteriorate. On the social level, there was a change in the attitude of citizens toward military service. Athenian families, who had once considered it an honor to send their sons to serve in the fleet or the army, now hesitated. The idea that even a victory could lead to disastrous consequences eroded the martial spirit that had been a pillar of Athenian society. Military education and training also suffered. With the loss of experienced commanders, there was a breakdown in the transmission of tactical and strategic knowledge. New generations of officers lacked mentors capable of teaching them all about the naval and land warfare, in which Athens had excelled. Athens' ability to project power beyond its immediate borders was also affected. Athenian garrisons in distant territories began to feel isolated and vulnerable. Holding these positions became increasingly difficult, both logistically and strategically. All these factors contributed to a gradual but steady decline in Athens' military capability. The city that had once dominated the Aegean with its powerful fleet and bold strategy now found itself on the defensive, reacting to the initiatives of its enemies rather than dictating the course of the war. This weakening was not a sudden collapse, but a slow process of erosion that weakened the foundations of Athenian power. The city remained formidable, but it was no longer the dominant and innovative force it had become at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. The road to its eventual defeat was being paved, not so much by the actions of its enemies, but by its internal struggles and the gradual loss of the qualities that had made it great. As Athens struggled with her inner demons, weakened by controversy and decline, the waters of the Hellespont were churning with a new threat. After the Athenian victory at Archidamian War, Athens' hopes grew, but only momentarily. The conflict was far from over, and the threat from Sparta remained present. Under Lysander's leadership, the Spartans devised a strategy that would change the course of the war. They knew that to deliver the final blow to Athens, they had to destroy its fleet, the greatest pillar of its power. The encounter at Aegospotami took place on the shores of the Hellespont. Athens, led by Admiral Conon, positioned its ships along the coast. The Athenian fleet consisted of around 180 boats, while the Spartans, under Lysander's command, had about 200. For 5 days, the two fleets observed each other from a distance. Each morning, Conon aligned his ships for battle, expecting a confrontation, but Lysander did not attack, keeping his ships anchored on the opposite shores. This apparent disinterest confused the Athenians, who couldn't understand the enemy's plan. Morale in the Athenian camp began to weaken. Many sailors and soldiers, tired of waiting, disembarked from their ships and dispersed along the coast to look for food or rest. The warnings from some captains, including Conon, about the need to stay prepared for a surprise attack were ignored. The lack of discipline, which had started to surface in the Athenian ranks, was exploited by Lysander, who carefully observed every movement from a distance. On the 5th day, the Spartan general decided that the time was right to act. At dawn, when most of the Athenians were on land and their ships unprotected, Lysander launched the attack. His fleet advanced rapidly, and within minutes, the Athenian fleet was thrown into chaos. The ships, stranded and poorly defended, were easily captured. The speed and organization of the attack surprised the Athenians, who had no time to reorganize or counterattack effectively. Conon, seeing the devastation looming over his fleet, managed to escape with only a few ships to Cyprus. The rest of the Athenian fleet, almost in its entirety, was destroyed or captured. Thousands of Athenian prisoners were taken and executed mercilessly by the Spartans, who showed no clemency on this occasion. The naval power of Athens, which had been its main strength for decades, crumbled in a single morning. The ships that had once controlled the Aegean were now in enemy hands. The defeat at Aegospotami left Athens in a desperate situation. Without a fleet and no means of defense, the impact was immediate. The Spartans, led by Lysander, wasted no time in blockading the port of Pericles, the main entry point for supplies into the city. By closing this route, food began to run scarce. Hunger settled in Athens, and the population, already weakened by the war and previous losses, began to succumb. The city was trapped, suffocated by the enemy and its own decisions. Within the walls of Athens, desperation grew. The streets of the city, which had once been vibrant and full of life, were now marked by silence. The markets emptied, merchants closed their stalls, and an atmosphere of fear gripped everyone. Famine struck both the rich and the poor alike. Families that once shared feasts now barely managed to feed their children with meager rations. Some began to debate whether surrender was the only option. Others, prouder, clung to the idea of heroic resistance, though deep down they knew that there was no longer any hope of victory. Meanwhile, the city's leaders faced an impossible decision. Surrendering meant submitting to Spartan power, but resisting would only prolong the suffering of the population. In the assemblies, speeches became increasingly bitter. Some proposed attempting to negotiate a more favorable surrender, though most knew that the terms would be harsh. Athens had been Sparta's great rival for decades, and the Spartans were not willing to show mercy. Still, any agreement would be better than complete annihilation. The hopes for a rescue or a counterattack opportunity were quickly fading. The situation was so dire that rumors of internal betrayals began to surface. Some citizens blamed their generals for the situation, while others pointed to the corruption of certain politicians. The social fabric that had held Athens together during its years of glory was slowly unraveling. Even Athenian pride, based on its democracy, art, and culture, seemed insufficient to prevent the inevitable. The Spartan blockade was ruthless. The city, known for its maritime trade, depended almost entirely on the arrival of food by ship. Without these resources, the population quickly collapsed. Diseases began to spread due to malnutrition and poor sanitary conditions. The poorest families suffered the most. In the poorest neighborhoods, it was common to see desperate mothers searching for anything that could serve as food for their children. Tensions within the city also increased among social classes. The rich, who still had some food stored, became targets of resentment. The poor, who had nothing left to lose, began to demand solutions. But in a besieged city on the verge of collapse, solutions were non-existent. The leaders' promises sounded hollow, and despair became the predominant feeling among the citizens. Finally, when the city was on the brink of starvation and chaos, the decision was made. There were no more options. Athens had to surrender. Envoys were sent to Lysander's camp to negotiate the terms of capitulation. It was a bitter moment, especially for a city that had been a beacon of Greek culture and civilization. The surrender not only marked military defeat, but also the loss of independence and the fall of its power. The Spartans demanded harsh terms, though they did not seek to destroy the city. However, the mere fact of accepting defeat was devastating for the Athenians. The walls that had protected the city for years were torn down, a clear sign of their humiliation. The warships that had once dominated the Aegean Sea were either burned or confiscated. And with every blow the city received, Athenian pride diminished even further. Athens' surrender marked a key moment in Greek history. After years of war, the city, once proud and powerful, was reduced to misery. Sparta, having achieved victory at Aegospotami, knew that it had the opportunity to impose its conditions without resistance. However, the way this unfolded reflected both the humiliation and the political realities of the time. When the Athenian ambassadors arrived before Lysander, they were met with an atmosphere filled with uncertainty. The Athenians feared the worst, the destruction of the city, something not uncommon in those times. However, Sparta had no interest in erasing Athens from the map, as they still needed Greece to maintain some stability. Instead of annihilation, Lysander demanded the destruction of Athens' fortifications, especially its famous long walls, which had protected the city and its port of Piraeus. These walls were a symbol of its naval power, but now they were to be torn down, stone by stone. Additionally, Sparta demanded the surrender of the entire Athenian fleet, except for a dozen ships that would allow Athens to maintain a small naval presence, though insignificant compared to what it once had been. This blow not only dismantled its military capacity, but also affected Athenian pride. whose power had been linked to the dominance of the seas. At its height, Athens had been feared for its fleet. Now, without ships, its hegemony over the sea was relegated to the past. However, it was not only the walls and ships that were destroyed. The terms of surrender included the imposition of a new government. Sparta and its allies did not trust that Athenian democracy could maintain order after the defeat. So they imposed an oligarchic regime known as the 30 Tyrants, a small group of men who, with Spartan support, took control of the city. This government, far from bringing stability, soon earned the hatred of the Athenian people, as it ruled with harshness and repression. The peace treaty formalized these conditions, ending the war but leaving Athens under the Spartan yoke. The city that had led the Delian League, which had been the center of Greek cultural and military power, now found itself in a state of submission, its citizens demoralized, and its influence reduced to a minimum. The Peloponnesian War not only transformed the fate of Athens, but also changed the political dynamics across Greece. Sparta, which had stayed out of the major alliances for a long time, became the most powerful city. However, this supremacy did not bring stability. Although Sparta imposed its government on Athens, the control was fragile. The differences between the Spartan oligarchs and the democratic sectors of other city-states quickly grew. In Athens, the Spartans installed the 30 Tyrants, an oligarchic government that ruled with an iron hand. This regime, which lasted only a few months, unleashed massive persecution against those citizens who supported democracy. The executions and confiscations of property created a climate of fear and hatred. However, resistance did not take long to emerge. Many Athenians flowed into exile, where they began organizing a counter-revolution. Led by Thucydides, a group of exiles returned to Athens and managed to overthrow the 30 Tyrants, restoring democracy in the city. Despite this change, the war had left scars on Athenian society. The years of conflict had weakened democratic values, and internal struggles continued. In the rest of Greece, the cities that had once relied on Athens for defense and trade found themselves in a critical situation. Sparta attempted to take control of many of them, but failed to establish stable dominance. The general weakening of the city-states opened the door to new political actors, such as Thebes and later Macedonia. The loss of political cohesion was one of the most lasting legacies of the war. Alliances were broken, and cities began to fight to maintain their independence in an increasingly uncertain landscape. The polis system, which had been the center of Greek civilization, began to crumble, leaving Greece vulnerable to foreign intervention in the following decades. The economic impact of the Peloponnesian War was devastating for all of Greece. Athens, in particular, suffered a massive loss of resources. The long sieges and naval battles drained its coffers. The trade routes that had made Athens an economic power were interrupted, and many of the colonies that supplied resources stopped sending supplies. The port of Piraeus, vital to the Athenian economy, became inoperative after the destruction of its fleet. The loss of access to the markets of the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean plunged the city into a severe crisis. Additionally, the war left much of the peasant population without land or with devastated fields. In rural areas, crops were destroyed and farms abandoned, leading to famines. The war also displaced many people who were forced to seek refuge in the cities, where living conditions were already precarious. These internal migrations created additional pressure on city resources, especially in Athens, which could not sustain the arriving population. On a demographic level, the casualties were significant. Prolonged military campaigns, combined with diseases such as the plague that affected Athens in the early years of the war, considerably reduced the population. Human losses affected both the lower class and the elite, weakening social structures and leaving many cities without the necessary leadership to recover. The war also harmed the workforce. With many men dead or incapacitated, cities had to rely even more on slaves and mercenaries for their daily tasks and defense. The lack of free labor slowed economic recovery in many parts of Greece. In short, The Peloponnesian War left Greece in a state of economic and demographic desolation. Cities would take generations to recover from the damage caused, and in that time, new powers would emerge to take advantage of the power vacuum left by the war. Thus ended the longest and most devastating conflict of classical Greece, the twilight of an era that forever changed the fate of Athens and Sparta and marked the end of independent polis as they were known. Over the years, the aftermath of this war not only transformed power in Greece, but also its history. This is the end of the account of the Peloponnesian War. Thank you for taking the time to explore this story. Without a doubt, there is much more to discover in the tales that are yet to come. See you next time.